Hello and welcome to the show. Today I have joining me Dr. Jay Joseph. He has his PsyD in clinical psychology and he's practicing in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has analyzed genetic research in the social and behavioral sciences since the late 1990s and is critical of medical models of human psychological stress and dysfunction. He is the author of four books, most recently, Schizophrenia and Genetics: The End of an Illusion, that came out in 2023. A complete list of his articles and book chapters is on his website, which I will link in the description below, and many of his online articles can be found at the Mad in America website. Dr. Joseph, thanks for joining me.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for this conversation. Kind of just getting into it. We know from various studies and major scientific breakthroughs that certain genes cause schizophrenia. So, what genes are these?
Well, that's an interesting question because I would disagree with that statement. I would argue that they have not found genes for schizophrenia. In fact, a lot of leading schizophrenia researchers and other people admit that, and that there are no genes, and that's really what the story is. That
Hmm.
there really isn't much evidence, if any, legit, valid scientific evidence that genes exist, and when they've looked for them at the molecular genetic level, they haven't found them. So I think that's really the story: is that there's a lot of claims about gene discoveries for schizophrenia, but actually there aren't any.
Hmm. And a lot of these claims, they were weren't they published in scientific peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, but there's a lot of stories in peer-reviewed scientific journals are not come true. For example, in the candidate gene era, the 1990s to the mid 2010s, there
Hmm.
were for 20 years all kinds of articles about gene discoveries for schizophrenia, and by 2015, 2017, they were all found to be false. They were all
Hmm.
false positives. 20 years, thousands of papers. In psychiatry, if you look at all the psychiatric conditions combined, uh, thousands of papers, including depression, they all turned out to be false positive. Now, there's a newer method called genome-wide association studies that's come since then, and there are claims based on that. But a lot of claims that are found in peer-reviewed journals turn out to be wrong. That's one of the
Hmm.
reasons we have a replication crisis in science.
Yeah, you mentioned replication. How many this well, how I guess how common or how prevalent would you say the idea is today that genes are the cause of schizophrenia?
Very common, very prevalent.
Hmm.
Uh, in every book, textbook, you will find every article. That doesn't mean it's right, though, just because they
Yeah,
all
yeah.
say that. So, but yes, it's very, very widely believed. The concept of schizophrenia itself is kind of questionable as far as whether that's a reliably identified, valid concept. The criteria can vary so much between people. So, there are many people, including myself, who question the existence of schizophrenia as opposed to, say, psychosis, which is not a medical condition. Uh,
Hmm.
as a valid condition that you can do research on. So that's another issue.
Are you saying that you would delineate between, so like schizophrenia is known today as largely as a medical condition, or but psychosis is more, that's not a medical condition?
Well, psychosis describes people's experience. Schizophrenia is a medical name for a medical condition, which there isn't really evidence that it is a medical condition. It's just called that. Yes, I mean, there are a lot of things. Compulsive gambling might be called a medical condition. Is it really a medical condition? That's an interesting question. Or, depression, that's another
Mhm.
depression, or a lot of things that are psychological problems that aren't necessarily medical conditions just because psychiatry calls them such.
Yeah, I spoke with Dr. Ronald Pies recently, actually, and he was talking about his the way he conceptualizes disease is basically dis-ease, and it's characterized by suffering and incapacity. And he takes a biopsychosocial approach. Um, and I brought up with him maybe the concern that if disease is conceptualized that way and you treat a disease medically, that seems to put a lot under the medical umbrella.
Yes, if you can call abnormal behavior, distressing behavior, negative moods, if you want to, if somebody wants to define that as disease, they can. But as far as I wouldn't characterize those as diseases, and a medical model is more about, disease tissue of the body, cells that are malfunctioning, these kinds of things. But if somebody, Dr. Pies, I
Mm,
have not encountered him personally, but I know that he has pretty sophisticated defense of the disease concept in psychiatry, but I would not agree with him on that you could
mm.
classify those as diseases. Yes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
mhm.
Um, when it comes to this prevalence, this common idea that genes cause schizophrenia and they're on all these textbooks, how many studies is that based on? Are they good studies? You mentioned replication earlier. Has there been an effort to replicate these studies?
Yeah, well, let's take it down from about the last 50 years, the four main types of studies. There's another one called CNV, rare variants. I won't get into that.
Mm,
But that's another one. But you have linkage. First, there was linkage, then candidate gene association studies, and then the current uh, genome-wide association studies, GWAS, and polygenic scores. The first two methods, linkage and candidate gene studies, which went all the way up to about 2015 and beyond, up to 2020, have been widely recognized by the top genetic researchers as to been a flop, a fiasco. Robert Plomin, a very famous behavioral geneticist, called it the candidate gene era a flop. I think that was the word he used.
mm,
And so the first two methods is widely recognized, even though thousands of papers and claims and textbooks and scientific books were claiming gene associations for linkage and candidate studies. That those have been a total bust in psychiatry. I can't speak for medicine in other areas, but in psychiatry and behavioral areas, was a total bust before the current GWAS era. The current GWAS era, there are a lot of gene associations, claims between genes, associations, and genes, genetic variants.
mm,
But association does not mean cause. So something could be associated with a gene and not really be caused by the gene. It could be caused by environmental factors that are common, confounding variables. So association does not equal cause. And in psychiatry, they have yet to discover genes that cause any psychiatric condition. There are many claims of associations, but not cause. And I know I was mentioning in psychiatry, the CNV studies, they're looking at the rare variants and similar idea, the association, but no proof that there's cause, that any gene causes a psychiatric condition or a behavior in most areas of behavior. So yes, thousands of publications, textbooks, say all these things about gene discoveries, and they all turned out to be wrong, pretty much. As shocking as that sounds,
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
I
have
sense
you
some
seen
disagreement. I
the
sense some skepticism on your part when I re-asked
Oh,
you.
no, 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 no. I'm just trying to
Okay.
think of how to proceed.
Yeah.
Because I was just thinking it. I want to get further into that. Um, as you were talking, have you heard? Sorry, this is kind of a derailment. Have you heard about the recent kind of research that they've done on cat ownership and schizophrenia?
I haven't read that, but again, that's another good example of a likely spurious correlation. So a lot of things are
Yeah,
correlated, associated with things. That doesn't mean they have any role in causing it. So that's
yeah.
I really
That's actually.
seriously doubt, yeah, that there's any cause cats cause schizophrenia in any way,
Mm,
even though it may be
that-
associated with it for non-genetic or
yeah.
biological reasons.
Yeah, that's one of the things that popped into my head as you were talking, and another one is I don't know how much this kind of coincides, but when you look at maybe when people are trying to determine risk of suicide, they have risk factors and protective factors, and are they at what level of acute risk and what level of chronic risk? And it's kind of the risk factors, they don't cause suicide. They might be associated with
Mhm.
suicide or correlated, but I don't know that you could say that they cause suicide. And I don't know if that's not a good example.
Well,
I
some of
don't. Do
them
you know where I'm
could. I
trying to
mean,
get at?
yeah, some of the risk factors, could. So, loss of whatever loss of a close divorce, or various things, they could play a
Hmm,
role in causing it.
hmm.
But what I wouldn't say is biology or genes plays a role in suicide. However, they do research on that too and claim that
Oh,
they like to use this heritability statistics. So they claim I don't really accept that concept for various reasons, but they would say, yeah, suicide is a heritable component, quote unquote. That part I would reject.
hmm. Yeah. One of the questions I wrote down was, um, I think one of the maybe the common understandings is that schizophrenia could be 80% heritable.
Mhm.
Yeah. Tell us what you think about that.
Okay, I will tell you all of the first of all, the heritability concept itself as a measurement of
Hmm,
how strong the genetic influence is has been
hmm,
disputed for a long time. So I don't accept heritability statistics or estimates. I do accept the idea that genetics might have an influence on something, but it can't be measured with a number. And also that 80% number comes from twin studies, mainly twin studies. And that has been a disputed concept for 100 years because twin studies, these are all reared together twins when we're speaking of
hmm,
psychiatric conditions, reared together twins, comparing identical and fraternal twin sets
hmm,
to see if the identical twins resemble each other more, for example, schizophrenia, than fraternal twins, they would say that's caused by genetics.
hmm,
But critics would say that identical twins also experience much closer relationship, identity confusion, or grown or spend more time together, and they have much more similar environments. So this is another thing you'll find in every textbook, 80% based on twin studies. But twin
hmm,
studies actually, in my opinion, don't provide any evidence that any psychiatric condition is caused by genetics. They're what we say confounded. They are not able to disentangle the potential roles of genes and environment. So I would dispute
hmm.
the heritability concept, 80%. I would dispute that. Yes, there's no evidence. There's no good evidence that there's any genetic component of schizophrenia, which I realize goes against everything that everybody's read their entire life to look into this question. Every textbook, every article, I realize that. But in
Yeah, yeah,
my most recent book on schizophrenia, I explain in detail why the evidence is not good.
yeah, yeah. Um, and the is there anything? What would be? What could a researcher do who's trying to pinpoint this to genes? Let's say that genes do play a role, or they do have a causative factor. How could that be uh, not proven, but highly suggested?
Well, do you mean what would be the benefit of finding the genes? Would that be another way to look at it?
Maybe what would I guess could there be some evidence that could convince you that it is causal?
Yes, it could be if there were better methods that could show that they're causal. It's possible. I
Hmm,
really doubt they're going to find it. They've been looking for over 50 years. This goes
yeah.
back to the 70s and late 60s, all kinds of gene claims,
Hmm,
and so that didn't bear fruit. So that's also the question of what a lot of genetic research diverts attention and funding from environmental causes of mental distress and dysfunction,
hmm,
which we have to
hmm,
look into society, not just families, but oppression, racism, a lot of neoliberal aspects where we're all kind of, especially in the United States, where people are very much more isolated than they used to be, less kind of friendship networks, families separated. So all the the billions of dollars that go into genetic research and psychiatry would be better spent on creating better living conditions for people
Mm,
and also researching more about what specific factors might be involved in psychosis, for example. So
mm,
when they do the gene studies, the rationale is that if they were to find genes, they could target better medication to target the genes, which would work better than current medication. So
mm,
I kind of doubt that, but that's part of the rationale. But otherwise, I don't really see the point of doing the research, especially since we can actually come to a reasonable conclusion that 50 years of gene discovery attempts in psychiatry, the failure of that, what I would consider to be the failure, would lead to a conclusion that genes most likely don't exist. It doesn't prove that they don't exist, but that would be a reasonable conclusion that it's unlikely that those genes exist. And, research doesn't really need to keep happening if that's the case. And even if it did, we could still question why the
mm.
research is necessary to search for genes. Why not make the
Yeah,
environment better? Jobs programs, alleviate oppression, all of these things.
yeah. The the whole reason that they began searching for a gene to link this to, it must have been a pretty powerful reason for them to still be doing this after billions and billions of dollars later.
Yeah.
Um, is are they still what is what was the impetus and why are they not able to let it go?
I think people really believe the genes are there. They're going to keep looking, but there's also economic forces. The drug companies have an interest. They fund a lot of research.
Mm,
It continues to divert attention from the environment, which in politics, you don't have to really fund programs or really invest in the environment if psychiatric if mental conditions are seen as something in lying inside the body. I think that's a key point. The current philosophy is
mm,
mental distress and psychiatric conditions, the causes come from inside the body, whereas I would say they come from outside the body, and that's where attention and focus. But it's an industry too, so if they give up, careers would be given up, funding would be given up. But it's even if they eventually found genes, it's really questionable whether that would be any worthwhile finding other than just discovering the facts of nature, I would say. So
mm,
this research, as I said, it's been going on for 50 years. The original purpose of psychiatric genetic research in the 1930s was all about what in Germany, it was based in Germany. It was called racial hygiene eugenics. It was all about breeding, sterilizing, and later killing mental patients who were deemed to have damaging genes that supposedly harmed society. And so the original of the psychiatric genetics field was born in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and it was all about eugenics and German and racial hygiene and attempting to eliminate supposed genes from the population. I'm not, it's, that's not what it is. Psychiatric genetics field is not engaged in that now, but that
yeah.
was that was what it was originally designed, it was all about until after World War II.
Mm.
And even after that, eugenics was a pretty strong part of genetic research in psychiatry, up all the way into the 60s.
Do you
This is a history a lot of people don't know. So I've
mm,
written a lot. I've
yeah.
written a lot about it. So
Is it in I really wish I would have I'm sorry for this, but is it in this most recent book? Is some of that history in there?
some of it is in there, yeah. And
Mm.
then there's some references in there to my first two books. And I did an article in 2013 with a co-author about a lot about that. It was published in the journal History of Biology, I
Oh,
believe,
okay.
if I recall. Yeah. So in the references in
Okay.
the most recent book, you will find some. And I believe in the family study chapter, I go into it somewhat.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, I wanted a quote here. This is in you linked a quote article to me from Mad in America, and this is largely circled around your book. And in it, you said, what psychiatry calls the societal burden of mental disorders is really the mental burden of societal disorders.
Yes. Mhm.
And I thought that was a very good quote, and it ties in with what you were just saying a moment ago about if we could take some of this money that we're putting toward all of this genetic research that has proven to be uh, perhaps largely a waste. Maybe if we were putting that in the environment and societal issues, maybe we wouldn't be in the current predicament.
Yes, and greater social equality. And right now, the wealth gets concentrated in the top, and people, half the in the speaking of the United States, half the people in the United States are living from check to check, or a third. And the billionaires are getting very rich. And instead of distributing some of the wealth, they would rather just say that people suffering under the system have some
Mm,
kind of disease or illness. And
mm,
so, uh, the United States is the richest country in the history of the world, and yet what percentage of the people have depression, anxiety? Why would people be depressed living here? I don't think they all just have brain malfunctions or bad genes or something in the environment. So genetic and biological research plays a big role in diverting people's attention from improving the environment, and that's part of what it's intended to do, in my opinion.
mm. Do you see an upcoming shift away from a biological view of things in medicine, or at least in
Mhm.
psychiatry and psychology?
Yeah, I wouldn't say medicine because, of course,
Yeah, yeah.
they're
I
medical,
tried
but
to correct myself.
yeah, no, I know, just to be clear. That's a very interesting question, very good question. I would say as long as the political atmosphere remains similar to what it's been over the decades,
Hmm,
probably not. There would have to be some more political change where people were kind of demanding more change in the environment and redistribution of wealth and those kind of things. But for right now, the established powers that be are going to continue this research regardless of not finding anything. And I say that, of course, I know that there's a lot of claims about, that depression is a chemical imbalance and schizophrenia is a brain disease. And I don't see evidence for that either. But
hmm.
obviously, something could be a brain disease and not be genetically caused. So that's why I separate those two
Oh,
things.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yes. So I think you would
Do
have to have
you
some political change to get some more shift focus away from biology and genetics.
and political change because how much would you say that the pharmaceutical companies are running things?
Well, I wouldn't say this running things, but they dictate. If you talk about big corporations, pharmaceutical companies, not just pharmaceutical companies, National Institute of Health, which is very mental health, which is very biologically oriented. They
Mm,
dictate the funding, so they say what's going to be funded. They decided, if they have, if let's just say all of these entities combined had $50 billion to promote research,
mm,
that they decide, okay, we're going to put 40 billion into biology and genetics and 10 billion into environmental stressors. But that's a
mm,
decision that they make. And if since a lot of the funding is in biology and genetics, that's really what's going to come to the forefront and be promoted. And people promoting those ideas are promoted financially, especially the drug companies. If you see a lot of these articles about medication, antidepressants, other things, or also a lot of genetic research, they're heavily funded by corporate entities. They need to get grants to do these things from
mm.
organizations with money. And there's a lot of conflicts of interest. If read now in the last 10 years or so, 15, they've had to list potential conflicts of interest. And it's amazing how many researchers, genetic, biological, pharmaceutical, or have ties to the drug companies, for example. They're paid
Mm.
consultants and get speakers fees and these kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. Is the National Institute of Mental Health, are they at all funded or by pharmaceutical companies?
I don't know exactly how it works, but I would imagine they're funded by congressional budget. They're given a budget by Congress to,
Hmm,
have this is the money that you have for the year. But they have a lot of ties with the drug companies, as far as I know, and there's a lot of In a lot of you may be aware in a lot of government agencies, there's a revolving door. For example, the defense war industries and the Department of Defense, and they go back and forth. They work for the same companies they
Hmm.
regulated, and also the National Institute of Health. So there's a close relationship, but I'm not aware that drug companies are funding the actual government,
Hmm. Yeah.
the institute, but they work together a lot,
Okay.
and they have
What is hmm,
common views of mental conditions.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, what is your view of neuroleptics and antipsychotics for people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia?
I would say that it's really up to people and their whether they want to use these or not. It's not treating a disease. It's chemically altering the brain, which, for some people feel that it's a benefit. And uh, it's a difficult position. If a 22-year-old shows up and is having psychotic symptoms, you want to help them, and it's very understandable that clinicians want to do that and other
Mm,
people, but it's neuroleptics they have a lot of bad side effects. They're hard to get off of, and they're not curing a disease. And so some people feel it helps with symptoms or family members, these kinds of things. So
mm.
I would say so. There have been a lot of critique on those also as well. But that's
I don't.
a little out of my area of expertise, I would say.
Uh, yeah,
But I do have an opinion, but I couldn't really give an expert opinion on that.
okay. Yeah, I don't know if this is. You don't have to answer this. you can say no.
Okay.
uh, in your personal opinion, like if you let's say that you experienced a psychotic episode or something, and it was persistent and lasted 6 months or more. Do you, maybe in your mind right now, not knowing how you would feel then, do you think that you would try to take some of those medications until maybe the symptoms abated and try to, or what do you think you would do?
Well, let's say I'm speaking about, so let's say that there's somebody I know who has this
Okay.
is happening to. So
Okay.
I would just say that I really don't know what they would do. I think it's definitely wrong. I know I've seen this where people will go and they'll say, you have a disease called schizophrenia. You have
Hmm.
to, uh, you're going to have this disease all your life and take medication for the rest of your life, and it'll help a lot. That's
Hmm.
just really the wrong approach. There's other countries that have much better programs, for example, Finland and other places where they don't treat people as having disease. They go in and they try to have non-medical approaches to psychosis.
Hmm.
And so uh, that's kind of how I would say it's hard. A lot of people who have symptoms don't necessarily think that they have something wrong with them, and other people do. So it's really hard
Yeah.
to say what a person would do at that point, I would say. But when they go into the emergency room or mental hospital, they will definitely be encouraged strongly to take medications, or even required in some cases, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I was curious recently, like if you um, had an advanced directive or something saying that if you ever were institutionalized, you didn't want to take medications. From what I
Hmm.
understand, they could still give it to you.
Yeah, I probably could. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know exactly how that would work,
Yeah.
but yeah, yeah.
Um, in the DSM-5, even then the TR, the I don't even know what TR stands. In the DSM-5 TR,
Text revision.
it text revision. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
It says there is a strong contribution for genetic factors in determining risk for schizophrenia, although most individuals who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia have no family history of psychosis. Well, can you help me understand what they're trying to, how that makes
Yeah.
sense?
Well, the second sentence would kind of strongly argue against genetics
Yeah.
because I believe that, yeah, of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, 80, 90% have no parents, so diagnosed that way, and 64% have no family members diagnosed with schizophrenia
Mm,
anywhere, all the way down to second cousins and all these things. So that would argue strongly against genetic theories. And then in the DSM, where it says they're just repeating the same story based largely on twin studies, also
mm,
adoption studies, which is a whole nother issue I won't get into, but mainly twin studies. they're basing this that because they believe twin studies show that schizophrenia is 80% heritable, quote unquote. They're just repeating that. It's also interesting the DSM does not have any references for any of these things, which is kind of fascinating. But
Mm,
uh, they're just repeating the common claim. Very few people really in the field really look into the assumptions and the original research articles to see whether there are kind of major problems with them, which there are.
mm,
So they're just repeating they're making two statements that seem to contradict each other, but they don't really go deeply into the contradictory nature of the two statements. Because genetics is all about passing on to the next generation genes for a condition, a medical condition, a behavior. It's all about running in the family, but here they're telling you that it doesn't really.
mm. Yeah. You you mentioned that a lot of people in the field, psychologists, psychiatrists, even they they get handed down this information and they don't really bother to look it up themselves, or if they do, maybe they skim it, or even they do more than skim it. But um what you coming from a PsyD program, I know PsyD programs vary, but I understand that they're more clinically focused than research focused. What
Correct.
got you so interested in the research portion of this?
I got interested 25 years ago or so, just reading some of the critiques of the critics of psychiatry and the medical model, and not really accepting the medical model of human, just psychological dysfunction or distress. And so I started reading a lot of critics, and then I kind of noticed that schizophrenia, for example, which I did my dissertation on, was kept saying it's genetic because of twin studies, and I hadn't really looked into twin studies that carefully. But when I did, I said, this is obviously the assumption that identical and fraternal twins grow up experiencing the same environment is completely untrue. Why are all of these textbooks, why is everybody saying that when it's obviously not true? And then I kind of looked for critics of this idea, and there definitely were some, but maybe not as many as I kind of had hoped to find. So that's where I kind of started like thinking that I needed to kind of start working on this issue. And so I did. So that got me motivated to really look closely at genetic research, partly
Hmm.
through the critique of schizophrenia as a medical condition by others.
And how has that journey been? Like, how have you been received in your work?
Well, as you said, yes, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm not involved in academia. I don't hold academic posts. So a lot of it I've been ignored, but um, so I've gotten a lot. I do get cited quite a bit and talked about, but not. I would say mostly ignored to the point where not the ideas that I put forward and the evidence I put forward is not really widely accepted or discussed, and the dominant views are kind of still have the main focus. But I keep doing it because it's what I believe is true, and I document very clearly why I think it's true, and hopefully, at least if it's not well accepted right now, that some point in the future, in a different environment and atmosphere, people will have these writings that I've done to look back and help reshape how society sees mental stress
Hmm.
for people.
Yeah, I on your website, I just the articles that are posted on your website, which I'm not sure how up to date it is, but there was over 90 articles on there, and
Mhm.
that's quite a bit of articles, especially for someone who's not in university and paid to do research.
Right, I'm not paid. I don't get grants. I do it because it's the truth as I see it, and that it needs to get out. And so I do that. And obviously, I spent a lot of time in the last 27, 26 years, more than that, working on these issues because I know it might sound corny, but it's the truth as I see it, and I want to get this side of the story out. But it does not help a career or promotions or jobs or anything. It's just getting out the truth as I see it and documenting
Hmm.
it very well, why I see this as being the truth.
Yeah.
But if I
You
held an academic position, if I were a Harvard professor, I would be getting more attention and discussion about my ideas for sure.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, do you think it's? Do you think it could? Hmm, how much do you invest in, let's say, marketing your research or ideas or books?
Are you saying marketing my research in books or other? I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, like yours. So maybe you've done a lot of writing, but how many people, I guess, how many people have heard of your work and at least heard of it and been able to choose whether or not they agree or disagree, you know?
Well, I would if I had been able to publicize it more, a lot more people, of course, would have been aware. I don't really go on book tours. I did do a brief one in 2003 in the
Hmm,
UK, but I don't really go on book tours or I'm not on major TV shows or all of these other things that people do to promote
hmm,
for various reasons. So that
hmm,
would help, but I guess I just hope for word of mouth and citations and these kinds of things to kind of help.
hmm.
Plus,
Yeah,
a
okay.
lot of the work I do is kind of analyzing and putting under the microscope research and studies, and that can be kind of tedious for people. It's not the most fun reading to just read a chapter on why a certain study doesn't hold water, even though it's necessary to do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. The most
Yeah, I
actually one of
actually.
the most recent things I was just going to say that I did because I also do a lot on genetics of behavior and intelligence. So a colleague
Oh,
and I we have a book chapter coming out, and it's also published as a preprint currently. It's an analysis of the genetic research cited in the Bell Curve, and you may be aware of that book that came out 30
oh
years
yeah.
ago with racial differences, and it says IQ is strongly heritable and various. So we actually looked in not just the racial difference argument doesn't hold up, but even all the evidence that they cited in that book in favor of high heritability of IQ or strong genetic component of IQ, none of their evidence holds up under
Hmm.
critical examination. So that's
Wow.
a recent work that I take pride in having, giving that out there for others to read to really see that. So most critics of the
Yeah.
book don't really get into the evidence what they cited, which is mainly separated or reared apart twin studies, which is another type of study that's not found in psychiatry, other than a few individual pairs. But as far as personality, so-called so personality, IQ, psychological characteristics, there have been the famous one in Minnesota, for example, and I've written a lot about that, really showing the really major flaws in those studies.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually, well, first, congratulations. That sounds like it's going to be a really important piece of work.
Thank you.
And the way I actually came across you is because I was looking into all of this different, the biological view of all of this, and I've seen so many twin studies cited, and I was looking up um, like critics of twin studies or why twin studies are not good evidence, and
Mm-hmm.
you were like the main person that I found to take that position.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, so I appreciate I read through a lot of your articles. And I appreciate your view on things, and I still have some ways to go in completely understanding it, especially if I was going to give a defense of
sure.
that view.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you mentioned that you have done quite a bit of writing on Mad in America. Is that I was going to ask, like, since your views are not really mainstream, have you found a um, a group or fellow, yeah, have you found many people who appreciate and hold your views and appreciate your work and a group that you can belong to?
Yeah, there are some of us, we kind of keep communicating by email, some of us who are in the critical genetics area, and we support each other and review each other's articles and these kinds of things. But it's a small group. There definitely are others. There are others that publish really good things on twin studies, Leon Kamen and others. But there's a small group of critical genetics people out there, not too many. And um, so that's what keeps me. I would be happy to pass the torch on to somebody else, but as I said, these colleagues are definitely doing good work, but it's a small group from the not non-mainstream. That just also reminds me if I go on when I go on Twitter or now called X about kind of when I tangle a little bit with people defending research, a lot of them will come up and answer, what am I talking about? The consensus says that twin studies are a valuable tool. Well, that's a consensus. I mean, a consensus can be wrong. So I don't really see that as a great argument because a consensus in science was about a lot of things that we now see as being really false. Candidate gene studies, as if I mentioned those before, and many other things. So the fact that my views are out of the consensus, or the consensus says my views are wrong, really doesn't mean anything because I need to see the evidence. I would be happy to debate representatives of the consensus and let others decide.
That would be fun. maybe I could host it.
Yeah, yeah, sure, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
um
By the way, one other thing, all twin
yeah.
research, not all, but almost all, most twin research will admit that identical twins grow up experiencing much more similar environments than fraternal twins.
Mm.
But they
Yeah.
continue to promote that assumption based on illogical arguments I won't get into now because it would really bore your listeners. So, but that's not even debated anymore. I mean, it's almost always everybody agrees that identical twins grow up with experiencing much more similar environment than fraternal twins. The difference is critics would say that shows that twin studies don't prove anything around genetics, whereas supporters of twin studies come up with arguments claiming that it still does, and then the textbooks rubber stamp that, and
Mm,
newspaper, the media. I've left out the media. The media will automatically,
mm.
uncritically report all of this stuff. I've hardly ever read anything in the media that was critical of twin studies or discussed the critics of twin studies. It's pretty
Mm.
accepted.
When it comes to twin studies, real quick, I'm going to try to simplify this is so basically you've got four types of twin studies. You've got identical and fraternal,
Mhm.
and you've got either identical raised together or raised apart, and fraternal raised together and raised apart. And
Yeah.
it seems that they show like the data is it goes by strength, maybe identical reared together, fraternal reared together, identical raised apart, fraternal reared apart. Is that kind of how it would go?
Well, if you're speaking of IQ, personality, and psychological characteristics, yes. I just want to
Mm,
really let listeners know that this does
mm.
not apply to psychiatry. Psychiatry, it's all about reared together twins.
Oh.
But in areas like IQ, I would just say that the most famous study is the Minnesota IQ study, which claims 70% heritability based on reared apart twins, which are not really reared apart, and they kind of hide the data. In most cases, they grow up knowing about each other, they spend time together, they live together.
Mm.
So, but in the case of the Minnesota study, like one of the most cited studies of IQ in 1990, the researchers did not publish their reared apart fraternal twins. They hid it,
Oh.
suppressed it, because if they had published it, they would have found that it was not significantly different from the reared apart identical
Mm.
correlation for IQ, and that would have meant that the study found no evidence in favor of genetics. So if you read that article, even though they had a lot of data for DZ apart twins, and even though it was designated as the official control group of the Minnesota study of reared apart twins reared apart, that there's no reared apart fraternal, also known as DZA,
Mm.
IQ correlations in that article or anywhere else. They've never published them.
Wow.
So this is why we have a replication crisis because
Yeah.
of, yeah, I mean, p hacking. If I don't know how many of your listeners are aware of that term, but it's basically manipulating data to get desired results. If I had to put it in one sentence, and
Mm.
one aspect of p hacking is hiding data that leads to a conclusion that you don't want to reach, and that's kind of a classic example, which I published recently a lot about, and hopefully that would get more attention at some point in the near future.
Yeah. How
Because
how
I
do
want to
we?
add one thing to that.
Yeah.
When they do molecular genetic studies like genome-wide association studies, they calculate heritability estimates based on the gene. So even
Mm.
though I would dispute that, the genome-wide association study heritability estimates for educational attainment, which is supposed to be similar to IQ, is less than 10%. So you have twin studies saying 60 to 80% heritability for IQ, molecular genetic studies saying 10% or less. That's a huge conflict,
Mm,
which I would interpret as being, there's a serious problem with twin studies. They don't the mainstream does not conclude that. So the
mm,
molecular genetic studies are overturning all over schizophrenia. The largest genome-wide association study that was published a couple of years ago, 2.4% is what's called SNP heritability
mm,
estimate versus the 80% twin study estimate you will read in every textbook. So this is a huge contradiction that in some way is causing huge waves and uh, questioning a lot of the early beliefs about twin studies that's currently going on right now in the behavioral sciences. I want to just add
mm.
that point.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. How do you, so with all of the problems in scientific research in the field of psychology and psychiatry,
Mhm.
such as some of the problems you mentioned earlier, like publication bias, so only publishing when you get good results and not publishing the results that you weren't looking for. Um, and then, well, my first question was like, how did we even find that they hid the data? And then my second question is, how much should we give credence to research and how much should we just disregard it because it's probably manipulated?
Well, I didn't say we should disregard. I just say that we should be very critical about, especially in the behavioral sciences. I would say much more than say medicine, although of course there's all kinds of stuff going on there too, or
Mhm.
physics. But in the behavioral sciences are very political, even though they claim they're not. They're just disinterested scientists. There's a lot of political aspects about psychiatry, behavioral sciences, IQ, and people have agendas and they want to publish results that support their ideas, which is
Yeah,
understandable. But
yeah.
they tend to manipulate data until they kind of get what they want to get. And so it's up to critics to kind of show that. If I give you an example, if I go back to the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, and this kind of
Mm,
answers one of your questions, how do we know that that they hid data, for example?
mm,
Because if fraternal twins reared apart, again, also known as dizygotic twins reared apart, or DZA, in 1986 and other publications, they specifically wrote in articles, this is our control group of the study. Reared apart fraternals are the control group to compare to the reared apart identical group.
mm,
1988, they published a personality study, which included reared apart fraternals. Every other behavior, almost every other one in the study, and there's many different ones, counted, published the data of reared apart fraternals, except the IQ study, which is actually the main area that they were looking at. The IQ
mm.
study did not publish reared apart fraternal twin IQ
Oh,
correlation. They hid them. To this very day, they have never been published. And the study was started in 1979, and its main
mm,
IQ publication was 1990. Very few people in psychology point this out, notice it. The lead researchers are given awards. So there's a lot of problems with how fields just rubber stamp findings
mm,
that aren't really findings. So in that case, it's documented that they went on record stating this is the control group. And then when they did the study, they hid the control group data.
mm,
They're in publications, it's documented. And in my articles, I show these things.
mm. Nice. Yeah, and just to be clear, I wasn't saying that you said we should disregard the research. That's more of something I'm thinking through of that with all of this, especially when it comes to, let's say, research for the efficacy of antidepressants or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like people point to the research, oh, look, but there's so much that can happen between the first phase and the publication that uh, I just don't know how much confidence I have in the research.
Absolutely. I mean, I think all behavioral science research, at least, should be looked at critically and not just accepting the results. In the case of what you just mentioned, a lot of people don't know, as far as unless this has changed, that the people who do the research on the efficacy of antidepressants are the drug companies themselves. They do the
Mhm.
research, they hire the researchers, and if they do 20 studies and 19 of them show that the medication doesn't help people, and one does, they'll just send the one to the National Institute of Mental Health or there might be another Food and Drug Administration, I'm not sure, to approve it. They're not
Mm.
required to uh, disclose all of the studies. They put it, it's called the file drawer problem. So they have a financial interest in getting their drugs approved. And some people who have actually gotten freedom of information on unpublished trials have published them. For example, I believe Irving Kirsch has published, when he got the full list of all the drug trials, some of them unpublished, he found that there was
Mm.
very little difference between placebo and antidepressants for depression, for example.
Uh,
So actually, in a just world, the last people who should be doing research on antidepressants are the drug companies, and they're financially motivated.
Yeah.
If the oil companies did funded research on global warming, probably people would
Uh-huh.
be skeptical, right? But
Yeah, why do we allow this with psychiatry?
yes, an Apple study of whether iPods cause brain cancer was conducted by Apple company. People would be
Mhm.
skeptical. Why are they
Yeah.
doing that? They're obviously have an interest. But
Yeah.
somehow with the drug companies, it's not widely known or publicized, I guess I would say. And even then the ones that aren't conducted by them are financed. And again, if they're interesting, people should go and read the conflict or competing interest statements in a lot of these studies. And it's
Mm.
just every researcher, not everyone, but many of them are in the pay of drug companies. So they have a conflict of interest. It never says how much they get. So they say that, you know, so some person is a paid consultant of Abbott Pharmaceuticals. It doesn't say, I mean, he could have gotten, or she, $10
Yeah.
or $1 million. Easily it could be $1 million a year as a consultant. I mean, it's whatever it is. I would like to
Mm.
see the publication of dollar amounts in addition to the conflict.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah. I would also
Where
like
do
to see
you
it in the abstract. I would like to see it published at the
uh
top of an article, not way at the very bottom that very few people bother to look at.
yeah.
Mhm.
With this recent book of yours, Schizophrenia and Genetics, The End of an Illusion, um, where do you see your work going from here?
I think I've said pretty much what I need to say about schizophrenia in that book and many other publications before that. But I think that's kind of my final word unless new research methods come out. So that's why I've kind of moved a little bit to IQ because I think that's a really
Uh,
important area and it has a huge history again with eugenics and sterilization and all of these things. It has a very long history, racial difference claims. So schizophrenia, I think I've said what I want to say, finalized in that book, which of course I'm very happy to answer questions about, but I don't know if I'm going to write that much more about schizophrenia, depending on what develops, I guess I would say.
hmm. Okay, yeah. No, that sounds interesting.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. Is we're coming up to the end of our hour. Is there anything that I haven't really asked you about or gotten to that you would like to throw in here?
No, other just maybe just to repeat a few points that
Mm.
psychiatry names these conditions diseases, mental disorders, brain conditions, and there's really not much evidence of any real valid evidence of that. There's no evidence that they're caused by genetics. As shocking as that may sound to many listeners, I'm aware. And that key point I made before that is psychological distress a result of something the cause is inside the body or outside the body. So inside the body, of course, genes, faulty brain networks, chemicals, or
Mm.
outside the body, social conditions. It could also be physical conditions, toxic chemicals people eat
Mm.
in the environment, the air, the soil, social environment, political inequality, oppression, isolation in society, emphasis on individual and not on groups and people being together in groups and being just more
Mm.
individual. So my emphasis is outside the body. which
Mm.
necessarily gets a little more political than inside the body. If the causes were inside the body, then that would be fine, but I would need to see some evidence, and the evidence I see doesn't really hold up under close examination.
Mm.
Which I realize, I also want to say, I understand when I say like most people in the field, they take for granted they don't read the original research. That's very understandable. People don't have the time or the interest to really go in to look at the original studies, and they just tend to accept what seems to be true to them. Schizophrenia is genetic. We could disagree with that, according, right? But so that's what the critics do. So we do look very carefully and we write about it, and at least we would hope that people would read what the critics say and balance it out more with what the mainstream says, not asking them to go back and read, for example, the Danish schizophrenia adoption studies that are cited in every textbook. You don't have to go back and read those. I have a chapter on that in my latest book, so you can read why I say that those studies are very faulty studies that don't prove anything about genetics, and then read the mainstream and then come to a decision. But only people who are really interested read the original research. And I also could add that a lot of textbook authors don't read the original research. They just read
Mm.
the abstract or they get it from another textbook, because there's kind of shocking mistakes when you really know the material and you see how they're written about. A lot of times studies are described incorrectly, names are misspelled, all of these kinds of things. Um, so even the experts don't always. I've documented this too. I mean, even the experts don't really read a lot of the original research.